Welcome to this recorded seminar on assessment with multilingual learners. In this short session, we're going to look at what we know about assessment, what are the challenges of using standard assessments with multilingual learners, and ways to assess that are accurate and meaningful for teachers and for learners. So in the pre-session reading, there was an article about multilingual assessment in India. I think it's a particularly interesting article to start with, because when we look at the context of a country like India, it's incredibly linguistically complex. There are 22 languages named in the Constitution. Hindi and English share national language status. And there's what they call the double divide between English and other state and national languages, with English being the most high status, and then between the national state languages and what they call ITM, or Indigenous and Tribal languages. And so you have, kind of a high status language in English, and then lower high status language, which is Hindi and the other state languages. And then in the lower status languages, you have national and state languages compared to Indigenous and tribal. And so this causes a lot of fractiousness within the education system in terms of the language of instruction and also the language of assessment. Because educationally, English is the status language and the language of power. And children then often don't have what we would consider to be a clear mother tongue or a clear home language at school entry, but parents will prioritize English over any other language in an attempt to give their child the best future. And so it's quite an interesting article in terms of the issues around power and status of language and assessment, and how being a speaker of certain languages disempowers you from the way the school system assesses, or being speakers of certain languages empowers you in terms of assessment. And so I think that, it's an interesting article in that context, but also this wider question we've been looking at, which is, how do we measure bilingual or multilingual children against monolinguals in many ways? And we find that as it's a measure that is lacking in fairness, lacking in equity, and lacking indeed in accuracy. And so we're going to talk particularly about standardized tests and how they reflect the monolingual norms of the societies we live in. So I'd like you to think about your own context and what kinds of standardized exams are used within that context as we go through. And then at the end, there'll be a reflection task about assessment. So I'd like you to take a few minutes just to have a brainstorm about how we assess. And so I'd like you to pause the video and just write a long list of all the ways that you have assessed in your career as a teacher, whether you currently use them or not, just kind of overall, how do we assess in education? So I'd like you to pause the video and write yourself a little brainstormed mind map or a list, whatever works for you. Pause the video now. So now that you've done your brainstorm, I'd like you to come back to that list as we go through this seminar to compare the different ways you assess and how aligned they are with the needs of our multilingual learners. First, I'd like you to take a moment to see if you can organize them into different categories, because we're going to talk about categories of assessment. And so again, pause the video, take a moment and see if you can categorize them in any way that feels a good fit to. I'm not going to tell you what categories should be, but the categories that you feel kind of emerge from your list. So pause the video now. So there are 4 different assessment types we're going to look at, and within those there are different kinds of measures we use, but we're going to talk about placement tests, diagnostic tests, formative tests, and summative tests, and the interactions these different kinds of measures have with our students who are multilingual. So we're going to start with placement tests. Placement tests are used for putting students into level groups or assessing entry into programs. So if you have, for example, if you're a school that does settings, so math sets low to high or English sets low to high, usually there's some kind of placement criteria. You might not give them a test per se. It might be something they come in with. But where we do use tests, we give what we call a placement test. It's really important to remember that placement tests with students who are multilingual are doing 2 different things. The first thing is they're ascertaining their level in that area of education. But the second thing is they're ascertaining their level of the language the test is in. And so if you have a student who is kind of band A or band B emergent in English, a placement test is not going to show their true math ability. It's going to show their math ability as affected by their level of English. And so we need to be very mindful when we use placement tests about the data we get and if if it is or isn't valid. Diagnostic tests are used to identify learning gaps or learning issues. So we use diagnostic tests when we're looking for special educational needs. We use diagnostic tests when we're trying to figure out somebody's math profile. And so diagnostic tests suffer from the same issues as placement tests in that they are also a measure of a student's level of English. And so kind of as good practice, we would say we shouldn't give anybody a diagnostic test in English until they've been in English medium school for at least 2 years minimum, because before that, all it's going to tell us is their level of English, essentially. Then we're going to talk about formative assessment, and this is the category we're going to talk quite a lot about because formative assessment is assessment for learning. It's where we gather information about student progress in order to inform our teaching. This is obviously the sweet spot for working with all learners, but especially multilingual learners. And we're also going to talk about summative assessment, which is how we assess final progress in a unit or a topic or any kind of summative overall measure of learning. And so the challenges for testing for multilingual learners with our placement tests, we have to ask the question, what is it we need to know? And how will the student's level of the school language influence how well a student does on that placement test? And so it may be a language placement test, in which case that's a fair measure. But if it's a placement test for anything else, we need to take language into account. We also need to think about that, what we call the test effect, which is that when we put students into a situation where they know they're being tested for something, they don't always perform to their best. It can be anxiety inducing or stressful. And so there is obviously then a risk that they'll underperform, not because they don't know the content, but because they're stressed out. Diagnostic tests, we also need to ask ourselves the question, what are we trying to figure out? What are we trying to diagnose, or what gap are we trying to identify? And then we have to look at the student's level of language and ask ourselves, how will their level of English or lack of level of English impact performance on that task? And for summative, we need to make sure that we very clearly think through, and we'll talk a bit about this further on, are we testing only content, or are actually content and the language inextricably linked, so that we're actually not only assessing their learning, but also assessing their level of the language of instruction? So when we talk about conventional assessments in schools, they're often from a very behaviorist position in terms of their views of cognitive development. And so we expect that we teach the students something, we test what we taught, and students show what they have learned. And so it's very Pavlovian, if you will, that idea of you do something, they do something, and then you test it. And so it's quite an old-fashioned view of assessment. We still do use a lot of these kinds of measures. But the problem with this teach and test approach for our multilingual learners is actually twofold. First of all, when we're teaching, do they have full access to learning, given their level of the language of instruction? And then when we're testing, will their level of language impact their ability to show us what they have learned? And so it comes in both through the teaching and through the assessment, that inevitable, if you will, educational inequity. We're going to look at this a little bit briefly. We often use the term tests and assessments interchangeably, but they're actually in the field considered to be different things. Tests are about accountability. We make a judgment about how to spend our resources. We measure performance as a progress measure. And often tests are kind of taken in secrecy. So the school gets an envelope on a certain day and they can't open that envelope until the testing time. And it's kind of this shrouded in secrecy. Whereas assessments are an ongoing strategy we use to track student learning and progress. It's about monitoring learning, and students can and should be involved in their assessment, their performance or their ability, whatever it is we're assessing. And so kind of see testing as things like GCSEs or SATs or any outward external measure. But teachers do make tests as well. So if you make an end of unit test that the students aren't allowed to see until the day of, and we're using it to measure performance, that also counts as a test, whereas assessments are more an ongoing strategy. So the challenges for our multilingual learners, first of all, what I alluded to earlier, this what we call the test effect. And so in second language acquisition, we have a theory that we call the affective filter, which is kind of the wall that I build up when I feel like I don't have full access. And that when students are put into a position where they are fairly sure they're going to underperform because of their level of language, that filter goes up and they are kind of sitting behind it and they're stressed and they're not really engaging well. A second challenge is their content learning. Have they had full access to learning the content, or has their acquisition of the content of a particular unit or scheme of work been impacted by their level of language? If you recall all the way back at the beginning, we talked about the difference between BICS and CALP, basic interpersonal communicative skills and cognitive academic language proficiency, the social and the academic. Where they are on their development of that, along that continuum will also impact how well they do on an assessment. We also know that we can recognize a correct answer in a language we're emergent in before we can recall it ourselves. So what that means is, if we give something where the students just have to find the correct answer, they'll be able to find it and go, yes, this is definitely the correct answer. But when we give them a blank piece of paper and say, tell us the correct answer, they may not have developed that recall of the content yet. And we also know that there's an inherent bias in assessment around language. In all of our kinds of assessment, we have to think carefully about the issue of language bias. So when we think about testing, all standardized testing, even standardized language testing, has bias. And that bias can be cultural. So it might be, showing the students pictures of things and asking them to describe it, and they don't know what's happening because there's a cultural knowledge that's implicit in that picture. There's also a bias of the variety of English. So even within monolingual systems, we elevate certain standard varieties of a language over other varieties. And so we may say, for example, you have to say I was sitting in class, not I was sat in class, and that I was sat would be considered non-standard and therefore incorrect, because that is not a part of the modern British Standard English or modern American Standard English that we consider to be the correct variety. And going back to earlier discussions we've had over this module, there's nothing inherently superior about the standard variety. It's just the middle class educated variety, but our tests are infused with bias about what a correct or good answer would or should look like. There are also other kinds of bias that come through in tests in different ways, bias towards certain question types or, certain ways of thinking or critical thinking that isn't taught in all school systems. And so our tests are kind of infused with all these bias areas. So this is an example from a standardized test. It was like the SATs in the UK. It's statewide mandated testing. Done at the end of primary school in California from the 1990s. It's quite old. One of the questions was a fill-in-the-blank question, and the question was, I eat beans with and they were expected to fill in the blank with the correct answer. And in the key, there was one correct answer. And that correct answer was fork. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say I eat beans with a fork. You may, but you may not. Excuse me. But in this particular part of California, there's a high number of children from Central and South American backgrounds. And so the most common response to this particular test item was, I eat beans with a tortilla. And so you can see their cultural bias inherent. Not everybody eats beans with a fork just because the test writers eat beans with a fork and think that that's the right answer. So we need to think about that through the cultural lens as well. So if we look past testing to alternate ways of assessing student progress, student development, keeping an eye on how our teachers are doing, all the things we like to do with tests, assessment should recognize that it's an ongoing process that involves both teachers and students in making judgments about learning. We have to acknowledge the impact of context on performance, and we need to involve the individual in making self-assessments for it to be really valid and inclusive. So Spolsky proposed a multi-level system for assessment that combines testing and assessment, so student self-assessment before and after the unit. Teachers assess student performance through regular tests and occasional external monitoring. And so we do have that external piece that most school systems like to see, but we're integrating other ways of assessment that are more empathetic and more accurate and efficient with our multilingual learners. So assessment for learning has been around for quite a long time, also called AFL. But it's, I think, something that we don't often consider enough when we talk about our strategies for tracking student support and student progress when we have a lot of multilingual learners. And so assessment for learning is the activities that teachers and students do to assess their own learning, that provide information and feedback for the teacher about how it's going in a particular unit. And so the evidence that we collect through that assessment is used for learning. It's used to influence how the teacher then continues teaching a particular unit or scheme of work. And so it is like a virtuous circle. We collect evidence on how it's going in order to continue the teaching. And then we see how it's going in order to continue the teaching. And so it kind of continues that journey through content. So we use the the assessment that we're collecting to make decisions about the next steps, and that it's a better way than just saying, well, we've finished that unit, we're going to move on to this next one. Well, how do we do with the learning in that one? Is there anything we need to review before we move on? And so it gives us really good evidence about what students need in particular to succeed. So assessment for learning is a part of your planning. It's focusing on how students learn. It's about our classroom practice, not necessarily external assessment results. It's integrative, if you will, with the students coming along with us. It affects their motivation. It's good for their learning. It shows that we're really committed to improving our own practice. And it helps our learners understand themselves better, how they need to improve, what they need to do in order to, make progress either at the same pace or more quickly. And it's also really effective for helping us just notice, the students who are struggling and aren't really making good progress. If we use really good, strong assessment for learning strategies, we can still find things that they have made progress in and turn that into an achievement for them, and then help them scaffold that into further learning. When we look at assessing learners with English as an additional language, this is a policy statement from NALDIC, which is the UK's EAL Subject Association. And I think it's a really powerful statement because it talks about fair and meaningful process of assessment, which pays attention to their distinctive needs and supports their language learning development. And so what they're saying is that essentially, unless we pay attention to the distinctive needs of our students with EAL and support them, then assessment would not be fair and meaningful. And so we can never give exactly the same assessment to a whole class of students if any of them have English as an additional language and are still developing, because it's inherently unfair to them. So this is an example from an assessment I saw in a school quite a few years ago now. The students were quite young. They were given this picture and they were told to label the body parts. And so I'd like you to just pause the video and think about all the ways in which this is problematic, because it's problematic in so many different ways. But I just take a little pause and then write yourself a list of all the ways in which this is a problematic assessment. So if I were to make my list, I would say, first of all, the boxes are different sizes. Does that mean the words are different lengths? What are they pointing at? Are they pointing at clothing? Or are they pointing at only body parts? The body parts aren't even clear. It could be his neck. It could be his Adam's apple. It could be his skin. So it's so vague as to be really particularly hugely challenging for all students. It's not really a good assessment at all. But I just want you to really think through that. Even when we're trying to scaffold and do something like, instead of giving them a paragraph to write, we'll just give them a picture to label, our instructions and the clarity of an assessment are really, really important. So if we're looking at equitable access and assessment, we need to always think through to what's in parentheses. So complete the math problems in English. Describe the life cycle of a fruit fly in English. Innovate, describe, compare, create in English. In every assessment, it is implied and usually practiced that only knowledge in the school language is acceptable evidence of progress. And so we really need to think about that whenever we're writing any kind of assessment. Who are the students in my class? What is their level of the language of instruction? If I give them the assessment like this, is it going to be fair and equitable? And if not, and usually not, what am I going to do about it? So complete the math problems. Or can they use a dictionary? Can they use a translator? Can we give them math problems that only have numbers and functions rather than word problems? Really have to think through how we mitigate the impact of learning the language of instruction on assessment. So I'm just going to show you some different ways of separating language from knowledge and skills that all fall into formative assessment, in particular to assessment for learning strategies. So performance-based assessments can be really effective. We can have them, act things out. We can have them draw things. We can have them, create some kind of visual. So it's all about showing us rather than using language in order to be able to assess how they're doing without the level of English or the language of instruction impacting. And so these assessments can be really successful if they can be designed well, because they can show us what it is they know and can do without any level of language at all. Observation assessment is something teachers use a lot of. We watch how the kids are doing, informal assessment. As we're teaching, we're paying attention to how they're doing. It has lots of pros. It's kind of ongoing. It's not intrusive. The students don't feel like they're being assessed, so they're not stressed out. But the really key con is that observation assessment doesn't really give us very good documentation about student progress. So what we need to do, not all the time, but sometimes with our observation assessment, is make it formal observation by building ourselves some kind of checklist that helps us bring a level of objectivity to something that is quite subjective. And so a checklist might be, how many times did the student do this? How many times did I hear them say this? Can be just observing their behavior, but we have a way of kind of making data or generating data through a checklist about their participation and their progress. We use a lot of questions to assess as well. Question strategies are all the rage right now. When we use questions to assess students with EAL, we need to really carefully consider the stage of language development of our students and make sure that we're asking questions that are of a reasonable level for their age, so that we're providing them with the right kinds of questions to get to what they really know and can do. And then think about, what kinds of support do we give them at different levels. So we're going to do an activity now. I'm going to again get you to pause the recording to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture. And what I'd like you to do is put your teacher hat on and make a list of 3 to 5 questions that you would use if you were using this picture as kind of a prompt or a provocation with a group of students. They can be whatever age you want. Once you've made a list of 3 to 5 questions, I want you to list them in order of easiest to most difficult, and really think about what your criteria are for determining whether a question is easy or most difficult. So here's your picture. I'm going to ask you to pause again, 3 to 5 questions that you would ask students about this picture, and then list them in order from easiest to most difficult. So please pause the video now. So looking at this picture, the first and important thing to recognize is that, and I've seen pictures like this used all over the world, this is a very particular iteration of what a farm looks like. And to many kids around the world, they wouldn't even know that this is a farm unless they recognize some of the animals. And so this is a very culturally specific picture that relies on a very specific cultural understanding of what a farm looks like. So that's the first important thing. Now I'm going to go through the phases of language development, and we're going to think about what kinds of questions are appropriate for different levels of learners. So what we're looking at is the kind of the language acquisition equivalent of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So that zone of proximal development is about working to just above where learners are. So they're kind of their level of cognitive development and knowledge plus 1 level. We call this I+1 in second language acquisition, which means their level of interlanguage plus 1 level of difficulty. And what that means is we have to kind of have a sense of where they are, and we have to peg our questions just at their level and a little bit above, but not too far, or we're just giving them no chance at all to be successful. So the 4 phases of language development we're going to look at start with pre-production, or the silent period. When students are in this phase, we can ask questions like the ones you see. Point to the cow, show me the pig, Bring me a pencil. Where is the boy? Okay. So all of these, as you can see, are questions that they can answer without using any words at all. And that's why we call it the pre-production phase. So this is, we really need to think carefully when we have students who are kind of new to English, band A, band B, emerging, that we have to make sure that we're asking them questions that they can answer without using language. So I'd like you to go back to your own questions, and I'd like you to just check, did you have any pre-production type questions? The second level of development is early production. In this phase, we can ask yes, no questions, either or questions, questions that have one or two word responses or that have concrete answers like nouns, cow, pig, boy, son, etc. So you can see that here, again, the level of output, the level of use of language is very, very minimal, and it's very concrete. And so this is for students who are still, in the early phases of developing language. The third phase is speech emergence. In this phase, we can ask questions that require elaboration, like what is the boy doing? Or why do you think the man is happy? Or etc. Questions like that. Or questions that ask for more information. Tell me about the farm, describe what you see. So all of these are like intermediate level questions and up. The fourth phase is intermediate fluency, and this is the first time we can effectively ask questions that require higher order thinking skills. So that's the CALP, the Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. So questions that ask to students to compare or contrast or evaluate, or that require reflection. So I'd like you to take a moment just to look at your questions, where they're situated on these 4 levels of language development, and if your criteria for easy versus difficult aligns with the phases of language development. This is really important because as teachers using questioning strategies, we have to go into an activity where we're planning to use questions as a means of formative assessment with a plan what kinds of questions we're going to ask which learners, so that we're targeting their I+1, their level of English plus a little bit higher. So if you have a student who's new to English, you'd be asking pre-production questions and maybe occasionally pushing into early production. If you have a student who's emerging from that first phase, you'd be asking early production questions and occasionally pushing up to speech emergence to see how they're doing. But if you've got a student who's in an early production phase and you're asking intermediate fluency questions, you're not giving them equal access to that activity or to that assessment. Okay, so this is just a really handy guide to keep with you in terms of thinking about something we do a lot as teachers, which is asking questions. If you're writing assessments, you have to really think carefully about how you write clear questions. And so this is just some quick guidelines for you. First of all, keep your instructions short and sweet. You don't have to be polite. You can be very quite direct, because the shorter the sentences are, the shorter the instructions are, the better. Review all of your questions for ambiguity. Don't use negatives. Don't say which one of these is not an animal. Absolutely not. And if you're doing multiple choice, avoid questions that have an option of all or none of the above, because those require the students to really carefully analyze all of the answers. Even if they can recognize only one correct one, they have to go back and be really sure. Think about those language levels. So give questions that they can answer yes or no, or true or false, or questions that have one-word answers, or look at alternate methods. Have them match words and pictures, or have them draw something rather than getting into the linguistic aspect that they're not ready for. Provide visual support for questions and answers, and provide whatever you need to make sure they have access to equity in that assessment. Using rubrics are a very good way to help us separate out performance on a task compared to language used in a task. So rubrics are really, really useful to help us do both of those things at the same time. But to be very clear, this is the student's content knowledge, and this was their use of English or the school language. So when we create a rubric, we determine what should students be able to do. So, write a one paragraph summary of the topic. Then we develop a task that will create opportunities for students to do that thing. We determine what a high quality performance would look like, and then moving down. So what's excellent, what's good, what's adequate, what's insufficient. And we describe in 1 or 2 sentences what that would look like. And then we create the rubric or a table or checklist that shows what must be done to attain each of those quantified levels of performances. So our students are really clear about how they're being assessed. And I'll show you a couple of really simple examples of rubrics and how you can use them for both self-assessment and teacher assessment. And so the endpoint, the rubric that you've created, can be used to provide EAL support as well, because it's going to show you those different levels of performance and what students need to be able to do. So this is one for story comprehension. So for use with, younger children, 5-6-year-old children, and you're doing some storytelling, and you want to know two things. You want to know comprehension, does the pupil know? And you want to know expression, can the pupil describe? And so you just set out the 4 areas you'd like them to understand: the main character, setting, the problem, the solution. And then you give a numeric rating to different kinds of performance. So does the pupil know the main character? Yes, they get 2 points. A little bit, they get 1 point. No, they get 0 points. And all of those all the way through. And so what this does is it provides kind of a pseudo-objective measure that is quite subjective normally in nature. Can the student retell the story? Did they understand it? And so from this, you can generate scores that help you understand a little better. For example, the pupil knows and they get 2s all the way through, but they can't describe. And if the student is still new to English, you say, well, that's perfectly reasonable. Their English is still emergent. As long as they're understanding it, we're fine. Whereas if they're further along in their development and they're still struggling with describing, then you can see that that's maybe something you need to target. So it helps us sort out the different kinds of performance. So the piece that's the understanding and the piece that's the use of English are separate. You can also use self-assessment really effectively using rubrics and student performance. So self-assessment reduces that effective filter. They're doing it themselves. They get to gauge their own learning. It provides feedback for the teacher about how the students feel they're doing. It helps them reuse the concepts and language that you're working on for them to have to use that in their self-reflection. It can be done through text, it can be done through pictures, it can be done through IT. There are lots of ways to get them to do self-assessment, depending on your teaching context, the level of your learners, and the age of your learners. Self-assessment should always be guided and not free form, especially with our learners with EAL, but not only. So you should never say, here's a piece of paper, write how you felt about that task, because that's just too big for young learners. So here's an example of a self-assessment rubric that can be used for kind of any kind of task. And you can see here, we're looking at different levels of performance. What are the things you can do by yourself? What are the things you can do with help? And what are the things you can't do yet? So I can identify the main character in the story all by myself. I can describe the main character in the story with help from my friend. And so you can see that the students can think through each of those kinds of criteria that would be obviously completed, and then decide, am I comfortable and confident with this? Do I need support, or am I not confident at all? And again, it is a subjective measure, but it gives us quite a lot of information about students' process the task and how they feel about their learning. Okay. So the final piece is looking at summative assessment. Excuse me. When we finish teaching the content of a unit or scheme of work, and we need to know, how did student learning go? We need kind of a summative assessment of their learning. Portfolios can be really effective for this, and they are kind of an informal measure, but we can, again, use certain strategies to give them a more kind of objective lens. So there are 2 different kinds of portfolios. The first are competency-based portfolios, which are focused on learning outcome. So choose your best piece of work that shows how well you can write a paragraph. Choose your best piece of work that shows how well you can do something. So they're putting in pieces of work that are their best to describe a certain series of competences. The second is bibliographic portfolios, which is just chronological progress. And so over a unit of learning, they might be putting in samples along the way, and then you have kind of a chronological view on their learning over a unit. Which of these is better for language learners? It really depends on what you want to do. Competency-based portfolios are good because it gives them the chance to say, this is my best work. Forget these 2 things. They weren't very good, but this is my best work. So it's really good for their self-confidence. But bibliographic portfolios can be really nice to show progress. And it can be nice for the students to see that progress too. Like, look, at the beginning of this unit, this is, this is all you were able to write. And look, by the end of the unit, how much more you could write. So it's a really good lens on their own learning and development that can boost confidence as well. And so you can use either. It's about making sure that the choice you make is aligned with the kind of assessment that you're doing and how that works with the rest of your content. If we need to use tests with our language learners, so if we need to do tests of any kind, but particularly standardized external tests, we can really teach them some skills to help them manage those tests. So as I mentioned earlier, the gold standard is no standardized tests for 2 years minimum. Not all schools adhere to that for various reasons. And if you have to have them doing tests of any kind, whether that's, the SATs or chem tests or any other kind of performance tests, teach them the question types explicitly, teach them the different kinds of questions, give them practice tests, not on their own, but as group work to kind of get comfortable with them, with the teacher, with a tutor, so that they're familiar with it before they have to sit it. Wherever possible, arrange for instructions to be given in their home language. There are definitely standardized tests that you're allowed to do that with an interpreter sitting next to the child and giving the instructions in their own language. If the point is to find out what they can do, the instructions shouldn't interfere with that. And so it should be fine to have the instructions interpreted into other languages and allow them more time. Developing the language of instruction, whether it's English or another language, is not a special educational need. But we do recognize that they share similar characteristics in that if you are developing English as an additional language, you're slower at reading and slower at writing than somebody who is a fluent speaker. And so we can offer the 20 to 25% additional time as a matter of course for our students who have been in the school for less than 2 years. The final piece we're going to talk about is how do we separate knowledge from performance? So language, the school, the language of instruction should be assessed as little as possible. Content knowledge should be assessed in ways that work around language as much as possible. And then we can take a formative approach to language development. So we're not saying if students write you a paragraph and there are lots of errors, ignore them. Pick one or two things that are persistent and highlight those. But if it's a history assessment, you shouldn't judge their English in that. If it's a math assessment and they make a spelling error or a grammatical error in an answer, we shouldn't be taking points off for that. So the content assessment should stand apart from any kind of formative language assessment that we do. So the only time we should be assessing the language of instruction is in the language of instruction assessments. So I want you to go back to the beginning now, all the way to all the different ways that you assess. Look, I want you to look at the list of types of assessment you listed. Sorry, listed. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. And think about how you could work on one to make it more EAL friendly or more friendly to your multilingual learners. You can look at the whole list if you want, but I'm asking you to look at one and just to really think through the ways you assess and whether or not they are empathetic, accurate, and fair for your learners who are learning the language of instruction. So that is the end of our short recorded seminar on assessment. I'm going to finish with kind of a typology of the characteristics of assessment and just a reflective task to go away and think about. So these are the criteria we would want to find in assessments. We'd want them to have validity, reliability, usability, efficiency. They would be holistic and equitable. In a perfect world, this is what our assessments would be like. Standardized assessment usually meet those first two criteria. They have validity and reliability. They've been tested on lots of kids. We know that they do what they're meant to do, but they've been tested on lots of kids who are fluent speakers of the language of the assessment. And so if we give students with EAL a standardized assessment, the SATs or a GCSE or chem tests, that same assessment, it no longer is reliable because it's not measuring what we think it's measuring. The second two set of characteristics, usability and efficiency, teacher-created assessments usually meet these criteria because teachers are good at creating assessments that are easy to use and efficient because we only have so much time. The last two that are holistic and equitable is where we really probably have a lot of progress to make. The vast majority of the assessments we use are not holistic or equitable for all of our students. And so this is the piece we need to be thinking about. For your fun stuff associated with this, there's there's a couple of funny videos. The first is the first is not a funny video. It's a really good video about assessments and effective accommodations it says ELL because it's an American video. And then there's a funny video that you can watch that shows the importance of precise language in tasks. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you in the next recorded lecture.